If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more emotional journeys that will touch your heart. Your support means everything to us. The waves crashed against the shore with relentless fury as Mark Sullivan stared at the small wooden box in his trembling hands. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a struggling single father trying to make ends meet at a corporate job he hated. Now, he stood on the shore of an uninhabited island, the tropical sun beating down on his sunburnt shoulders, holding his boss's final request, a request that would change everything he thought he knew about his life. "Open it when you're ready," Katherine had whispered, her voice growing weaker with each passing hour. "Not before." Mark ran his thumb over the intricate carvings on the box, remembering the woman who had been both his tormentor and savior. The woman who, in her final moments, had looked at him with eyes that held secrets he couldn't begin to understand. He took a deep breath and opened the lid. 3 weeks earlier, Mark had been rushing through his morning routine, the organized chaos that defined his life as a single father to 8-year-old Emma. The kitchen counter was cluttered with half-prepared lunch items, his tie hung loose around his neck, and Emma's hair remained stubbornly untamed despite his best efforts with the brush. "Daddy, you're doing it wrong again," Emma complained, reaching up to take the brush from his hands. Her small fingers worked through her own auburn curls with practiced ease, a skill she'd been forced to develop far too young. "Sorry, Princess," Mark sighed, glancing anxiously at his watch. "We're running late again." "We're always running late," Emma replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child who had grown accustomed to their hectic schedule. Mark felt the familiar pang of guilt that had become his constant companion since his wife Sarah's death 3 years ago. Cancer had taken her quickly, leaving him to navigate parenthood alone while trying to maintain his job as a financial analyst at Westbrook Enterprises. Every day felt like a high-wire act without a safety net. "Mrs. Peterson said she'll wait for me if we're late again," Emma offered, trying to ease his worry as she always did. At 8 years old, she had become the emotional caretaker in their relationship, a role reversal that broke Mark's heart. "That's not the point, Em. I promised I'd do better this week." He handed her the lunch box he'd finally finished packing. "And I'm trying." The drive to Emma's school was filled with their usual morning ritual, Emma quizzing him on her spelling words while he mentally prepared for the day ahead. Katherine Westbrook, his direct supervisor and the company's CFO, had scheduled an early meeting to discuss the upcoming quarterly report. Being late was not an option. Katherine Westbrook was a legend in the financial world, brilliant, demanding, and notoriously difficult to please. At 45, she had built Westbrook Enterprises from a small family business into a global financial powerhouse. Unmarried and childless, she seemed to live only for her work, expecting the same dedication from her employees. Mark had been on the receiving end of her exacting standards more times than he cared to remember. The late-night emails, the weekend work requests, the cutting remarks when his family responsibilities interfered with work deadlines. Yet, despite her demanding nature, there was something about Katherine that commanded not just fear, but respect. She was fair, if uncompromising, and her business instincts were unparalleled. After dropping Emma off at school, 5 minutes late, despite his best efforts, Mark rushed into the Westbrook building, taking the elevator to the 32nd floor. Katherine's assistant, a perpetually anxious young man named Tyler, intercepted him before he could reach the conference room. "She's been asking for you," Tyler whispered, his eyes wide. "And she's in one of her moods." Mark straightened his tie and took a deep breath. "When isn't she?" The conference room was empty except for Katherine, who stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She didn't turn when he entered, continuing to stare out at the skyline as though searching for something in the distance. "You're late, Sullivan," she said, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "I'm sorry, Ms. Westbrook." Emma had. "Your daughter." "Yes, I know." She finally turned to face him, and Mark was startled by her appearance. Katherine had always been the picture of corporate perfection, tailored suits, immaculate makeup, not a hair out of place. Today, there was something different. A pallor to her skin, a slight tremor in her usually steady hands. "Are you feeling all right?" The question slipped out before he could stop himself. Katherine's eyebrow arched in surprise. "My health is not your concern, Sullivan." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit. We have matters to discuss." For the next hour, they reviewed the quarterly reports, Katherine drilling into details with her usual precision. Yet something was off. She seemed distracted, occasionally losing her train of thought, something Mark had never witnessed in the 5 years he'd worked under her. As they concluded, Katherine closed her laptop with a decisive click. "I need you to accompany me on a business trip next week." Mark felt his stomach drop. "A trip? I can't just leave Emma. I'm all she has." "I'm aware of your situation, Sullivan." Katherine's voice was uncharacteristically soft. "Bring her along." Mark stared at her, certain he had misheard. "Bring Emma? We'll be traveling to meet with potential investors in the Maldives. The resort is family-friendly. Your daughter can enjoy the amenities while we work." She gathered her papers, avoiding his gaze. "Consider it a working vacation. God knows you could use one." Before Mark could respond, Katherine stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "My assistant will send you the details. We leave on Monday." As she reached the door, she paused, her back still to him. "And Sullivan? Don't make me regret this accommodation." The door closed behind her, leaving Mark in stunned silence. In 5 years, Katherine Westbrook had never shown the slightest interest in his personal life, let alone made accommodations for it. Something was definitely wrong. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation and explanation. Emma was ecstatic about the trip, peppering Mark with endless questions about the ocean, tropical fish, and whether they might see dolphins. Mark tried to temper her excitement with reminders that he would be working for much of the time, but her enthusiasm was infectious. By Monday morning, as they boarded the private jet Katherine had arranged, even Mark found himself looking forward to the trip. Emma's eyes widened as they stepped onto the luxurious aircraft, her small hand gripping his tightly. "Daddy, is this really how your boss travels all the time?" she whispered in awe. "Ms. Westbrook works very hard for what she has," Mark replied, guiding Emma to their seats. Katherine was already aboard, engrossed in paperwork at a small table. She glanced up briefly as they entered, her eyes lingering on Emma for a moment before returning to her work. "Make yourselves comfortable. It's a long flight." To Mark's surprise, halfway through the journey, Katherine closed her laptop and moved to sit across from Emma, who was drawing in her sketchbook. "What are you working on?" Katherine asked, her voice gentler than Mark had ever heard it. Emma looked up, momentarily shy in the presence of the woman her father had described as scarier than the principal. "It's a sea turtle. We learned about them in science class." "May I see?" Katherine asked, and Emma hesitantly turned her sketchbook around. "That's quite good. You have talent." Emma beamed at the praise. "My mom was an artist. Daddy says I got it from her." A shadow passed over Katherine's face. "Your father is probably right." She glanced at Mark, who was watching the interaction with undisguised surprise. Talent often runs in families. For the remainder of the flight, Katherine engaged Emma in conversation about her school, her interests, and her dreams of becoming a marine biologist. Mark observed in silent amazement as his intimidating boss revealed a side he'd never imagined existed, patient, attentive, and genuinely interested in his daughter's chatter. When Emma eventually dozed off, Katherine returned to her seat across from Mark. "She's a remarkable child," she said quietly. "You've done well with her, despite the circumstances." "Thank you," Mark replied, still trying to reconcile this version of Katherine with the woman who had made his professional life so challenging. "She makes it easy. She's resilient, like her mother was." Katherine nodded, her gaze distant. "Resilience is a valuable trait. One that's often born of necessity rather than choice. She looked at him directly, her expression unreadable. The meetings begin tomorrow afternoon. The morning is yours to spend with Emma. I've arranged for a suite with an adjoining room for her. That's very generous, Mark said, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. May I ask why you're doing all this? It's not exactly consistent with company policy. Catherine's lips curved in a small, sad smile. Let's just say I'm reassessing certain priorities, Sullivan. Don't read too much into it. With that cryptic response, she returned to her work, leaving Mark with more questions than answers. The resort was even more spectacular than the brochures had suggested: crystal clear waters, pristine beaches, and luxurious accommodations that made Emma squeal with delight. As promised, Mark had the morning free, which they spent exploring the beach and snorkeling in the shallow reef just offshore. Watching Emma's face light up as colorful fish darted around her, Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It had been too long since they'd had time like this together, unencumbered by the pressures of work and daily responsibilities. Daddy, look! Emma called, pointing to a small octopus camouflaged against a coral formation. It's changing colors. Mark swam closer, sharing in her wonder. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a life where moments like these weren't rare treasures but everyday occurrences. A life where he wasn't constantly torn between being a good father and a good employee. The morning passed too quickly, and soon it was time for Mark to prepare for the investor meetings. He dropped Emma off at the resort's kids' club, where a full day of supervised activities awaited her. You'll be good, right? He asked, kneeling to her level. Emma nodded solemnly. I promise. And you'll be good for Ms. Westbrook? Mark chuckled. I'll certainly try. The meetings were scheduled on a luxury yacht that would take them around the nearby islands while they discussed business. As Mark boarded, he found Katherine already in conversation with a group of potential investors, wealthy individuals looking to diversify their portfolios. Throughout the afternoon, Mark was surprised by Katherine's approach. Rather than her usual aggressive pitch, she was thoughtful and measured, emphasizing the company's commitment to sustainable growth and ethical investment practices. It was a side of Westbrook Enterprises he hadn't seen highlighted before, and the investors seemed impressed. During a brief break, Mark found himself alone with Katherine at the yacht's railing, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. You're different here, he observed cautiously. Katherine didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the distant islands. Different how? More. I don't know. Reflective, maybe. Less focused on immediate returns and more on long-term impact. She was quiet for so long that Mark thought she might not respond. When she finally did, her voice was soft, almost lost in the sound of the waves. When you face your own mortality, Sullivan, you begin to question what legacy you're leaving behind. The statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Before Mark could formulate a response, Katherine straightened her shoulders and turned back toward the meeting area. We should rejoin the others. There's still much to discuss. The rest of the afternoon proceeded smoothly, with several investors expressing serious interest in Katherine's proposals. As they prepared to return to the resort, the yacht's captain approached with concern etched on his weathered face. Ms. Westbrook, I've just received word of an approaching storm system. Nothing too serious, but we should head back immediately to avoid rough seas. Katherine nodded. Of course, Captain. Safety first. As they made their way back, the sky darkened ominously, the previously gentle waves growing choppy. Mark felt a twinge of worry, thinking of Emma waiting for him at the resort. Katherine must have noticed his expression. She'll be fine, Sullivan. The resort has excellent safety protocols. I know, Mark replied, though the reassurance did little to ease his concern. It's just, after losing Sarah, I'm always afraid of something happening to Emma when I'm not there. Katherine studied him for a moment. That fear never goes away, I imagine. But you can't let it consume you. Trust me on that. There was something in her tone that suggested personal experience, though Mark knew Katherine had no children of her own. Before he could ponder this further, a violent wave struck the yacht, sending everyone stumbling. The captain's voice came over the intercom, tense but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please move to the main cabin and secure yourselves. The storm has intensified unexpectedly." What happened next was a blur of chaos and terror. The yacht pitched and rolled as the storm unleashed its fury. Equipment crashed to the floor, glass shattered, and the investors huddled together in frightened silence. Mark found himself next to Katherine, who maintained a remarkable calm despite the situation. "We'll be fine," she said, though Mark noticed her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of her seat. "The captain knows these waters." But the captain's experience proved insufficient against nature's wrath. A massive wave struck the yacht broadside, and Mark heard the sickening sound of the hull cracking. Water began pouring in, and the captain's voice, now edged with panic, ordered everyone to the lifeboats. In the scramble that followed, Mark lost sight of Katherine. The crew managed to deploy 2 lifeboats, loading the terrified investors as the yacht listed dangerously. Mark searched frantically for Katherine, finally spotting her helping an elderly investor toward the nearest lifeboat. "Katherine," he called over the howling wind. "We need to go." She nodded, guiding the investor into the crowded boat. As she turned to join them, another wave crashed over the deck, sweeping her off her feet. Mark lunged forward, catching her arm just before she could be carried overboard. "I've got you," he shouted, pulling her toward him with strength born of adrenaline. They made it to the second lifeboat just as the yacht began its final descent into the churning sea. The small craft was tossed mercilessly by the waves, its occupants clinging to whatever handholds they could find. Through the driving rain, Mark could see the other lifeboat being pushed in a different direction by the current. Hours passed in a nightmarish struggle against the elements. Dawn broke to find their lifeboat damaged and taking on water, with only Mark, Katherine, and 1 crew member remaining. The others had been lost to the sea during the night, a reality Mark couldn't bear to process fully as he bailed water with his bare hands. "Land," the crew member suddenly shouted, pointing to a dark shape on the horizon. "There's an island." With renewed determination, they used the remaining oar to guide the failing lifeboat toward the distant shore. As they drew closer, Mark could make out a white sand beach backed by dense tropical vegetation, an uninhabited island, from the look of it. The lifeboat finally gave out just 50 yards from shore. "We'll have to swim," Mark called, helping Katherine into the water. The crew member, a young man named Jason, supported her from the other side as they fought their way through the surf. When they finally collapsed on the beach, exhaustion overtook them. Mark's last conscious thought before darkness claimed him was of Emma, waiting for a father who wouldn't return. Mark awoke to the sound of Katherine's voice, urgent and concerned. "Sullivan. Mark, wake up." He opened his eyes to find her kneeling beside him, her usually perfect appearance now a distant memory. Her clothes were torn and salt-stained, her hair tangled with sand and seawater. "Emma," he croaked, his throat raw from swallowing seawater. "I need to get back to Emma." Katherine's expression softened with sympathy. "I know. We all need to get back. Jason is scouting the island to see if there are any signs of habitation or other survivors.